Good morning, everyone. Malo Elele and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Welcome to Session 8, From Labor Mobility to Integration, Migration to, from, and within the Pacific. In the spirit of our Blue Pacific, we often speak of ourselves as a sea of islands, connected and not divided by the ocean. Today's session reflects that very reality, the movement of our people, our identities, and our futures across borders and within our own shores. Migration in the Pacific is not just about movement, it's about family, opportunity, resilience, and sometimes displacement. It carries both promise and tension, shaping how we belong, how we adapt, and how we remain connected to our homes. This session will explore the realities of labor mobility and migration pathways, the complexities of integration and displacement, and the evolving dynamics of intra-regional movement within the Pacific. We're so privileged to have leading scholars and practitioners guiding this important Talanoa, in which we have Associate Professor Ryan Edwards from the Development Policy Center here at the ANU, Dr. Nayahamui Rooney from the School of Culture, History and Language at ANU, and Dr. Alisi Holani, Peso Plus Implementation Unit, and apologies from Dr. Charlotte Bedford, who's unable to be here today. Please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Ryan Edwards to lead the panel discussion today. Malo.
Malo. Good morning, everyone. We put this panel together partly because Pacific migration research and policy tends to be a little bit siloed. There's a temporary labour mobility conversation, a permanent migration conversation, an intra-regional mobility conversation, and one on displacement, resettlement. These conversations tend to happen in different rooms, involve different government departments, and often draw on different disciplinary traditions. But they're really about the same people, same countries, and within the same policy architecture. And they interact in ways that we really don't talk about enough. I'm really thrilled and honoured to have two of our most impressive former ANU PhD scholars join me on the panel today. Dr. Alisi Holani and Dr. Nayahamui Rooney. And as I was introduced, my name is Ryan Edwards. But I'll give you one example of where these things intersect. So the PALM scheme brings Pacific workers to Australia temporarily. The Pacific Engagement Visa, which my colleagues put on a panel on 2 days ago, lets people come here and settle permanently. Very different programs with very different objectives. But in practice, we see a growing number of PALM workers now transitioning to the PEV or to other visa classes, including protection visas, which is an entirely different pathway again. And the same Pacific countries sending workers to Australia under PALM are also dealing with significant internal migration. And in some cases, as Nayahamui will discuss, with forced displacement of their own citizens within their borders, within this broader mobility discourse. And there's also these newer intra-regional mobility pilots which operate in a context where the Australia and New Zealand facing schemes tend to dominate the landscape and shape expectations. So we're trying to bring these conversations together in this panel. First, Nayahamui will examine what she calls disintegration on the margins of migration policy discourse, very appropriately, which is the end of the spectrum we don't hear quite enough about in the labour mobility world. Then Alisi will discuss her work on intra-mobility pilots, and I'll take stock of Pacific Australia migration and some of the current policy tensions before having a discussion together at the end. Please do, throughout the panel, listen about the connections between the different presentations and think about what integration means to you and what it should mean in this context. With that, I'd like to please hand over to you, Nayahamui.
Morning, Olgeta. Me like give him look save igolo last place line blo Canberra Ken Australia Nganawal Ngambri people, First Nations people. We're talking about land and migration, so we acknowledge again, as always, it's unceded unceded lands, and I am a guest learning, living on this space. You have to forgive me, I'm a bit nervous. I was delightfully drawn into this process this week to introduce the weaving theme and kind of left my slides a bit, I neglected that part of it. I thought I could speak without slides. I'm really admiring people talking this week, but I'm not that confident, so I've got my slides to help me, guide me in case I go off the path. Just to explain, today I'm trying to bring two strands of my research that are often quite separate and that I've been following since 2012. Both of them somehow emerged in 2012 when I began my PhD. I found myself, I had wanted to look at internal migration and issues of cultural transformation in Papua New Guinea, and I found myself, through my in-laws, again talking about our relationships, in one of Port Moresby's urban settlements. And so I stayed amongst my partner's people in that settlement and conducted my field work there. So that's one strand. While in Port Moresby, we had the announcement about the Manus Island Detention Center reopening 2012. And my mother, as you all know, is Manus. I'm a Manus woman. So I had kind of no choice but to follow it. It caused a lot of anxiety for me because Mom was alive then. She was very, very strong, very powerful. Many of you who are from Papua New Guinea will know her, Nahau Runi. Very strong woman, but at the same time, as a person who had then just moved to Australia, following my father's strand, white Australia, coming here, I found myself in a very strange space, trying to understand Australian politics and what's going on at home, the reality of what's going on at home, and then all the news that was coming out. So that's where I kind of entered into those two strands, which over the years I've kept. The two parts. I say I do this project and this project. And today's topic was like thinking through the issues. It was like, actually there's something about both of these that converge, and around migration, around human mobility, around the way we treat people. And so I gave a bit of insight there into my positionality. I'm a kind of confused human being who's a bit nowhere here nor there. My position is, when I present my graphs, my position's a straight line, woven line between Canberra and Manus Island. Dad died, buried in Manus. Mom died, buried in Manus, grew up in Manus, born in Port Moresby with family in Australia. So my entire life has been spent traversing these strands across. So when we talk local, when we talk the circle of being, sometimes I'm like, am I in that circle or that circle? And I believe I'm not the only person. I believe there are many of us that it's a space we have to also acknowledge is an important space in what we know and understand about the Pacific. So let me go. I'm going to go first with the asylum seeker stuff and then with the urban settlement stuff. So this is talking about Australia's asylum seeker policy, it comes on the back of very long history of what it is to be Australian, what is this construct of white Australia, which started, during the colonial period, but became formalized in law with the White Australia policy in 1901. So the Australian borders, that physical island, is actually cemented in law. And so I was thinking this morning, we were talking about the kava circles and who belongs in the kava circle and where you belong. And this is John Howard, one of Australia's former prime ministers. A bit of history. when you begin following this issue, so I came to Australia 2010. I took up Australian citizenship and found myself here trying to understand Australian policy. You know, when I was in Papua New Guinea working in development, it was all, Australia was the donor giving funds and everything was kind of nice. You were going to talk about human rights and equality. And then you arrive here and suddenly it's like, oh, all right, there's something different here. I have to understand. And so that's where I come in, not the Pacific side, but as a voter here. Who am I voting for and what's happening here in Australia? So I began to see, like, at the heart of Australia's cover inner circle is this question of migration. Who can come into Australia? The cover, there's a word you use for the circle, the inner circle, is migration. First, a white Australia policy, and you can trace it. We don't have time today, but mainly that white Australia policy is at the foundational roots of it. So you have then an internal tension in Australia that kind of is internally debating between border security, which is who can come into Australia, this island, versus, oh, we belong to an international community and we need to meet our international obligations to human rights. And this is particularly in respect to asylum seekers who are fleeing conflict from other parts of the world. So 2001, there is history to it, but 2001 was a defining moment for Australian policy on migration. So you had the Tampa affair, which was a Norwegian boat. You had a conflict in the world, so people are coming into Australia, that this Norwegian boat picked up several hundreds whose boat was sinking. They were coming from Indonesia across. And the Australian government refused to let these people in. Under international law, the Norwegian captain was obliged to pick these people. So it's a landmark case in terms of Australia's border security. Australia, again, not to go into the details, but to say that the parliament went into a flurry to establish a system and policy and legislation to prevent those people from coming in. First step, they did not meet their own international obligations. That, in 2001, was around the same time as you had the 9/11 conflict. And so what happened then was that the whole world changed from development and human rights, that kind of nice idea, towards counterterrorism. We're going to now. So it became a more harsher, more security-based international order. And finally, you had the Australian elections, and this issue became central to the Australian elections. And so this now is a famous quote by the Prime Minister Howard, who won that elections, saying to the people of Australia, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances by which they come." Undercurrent there is white Australia. It's not a nice thing to say, but it is what it is. So then from there, that triggered the opening of Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. They opened the asylum detention center and people got channeled into the Pacific, forcefully channeled into the Pacific. And they were closed in 2008, I think under the Rudd government, am I right, Australian colleagues here. Then you saw global unrest again, and it's like a cycle here. Boat people increase, arriving by boat. In 2012, it was opened again under the Peter O'Neill and Kevin Rudd leadership, and I was then in Port Moresby when it happened. So it opened under a much harsher regime. The message was, you will never come to Australia, and you will be sent to Manus Island, Manus Province, and Nauru. And this was amidst a global context of mass migration, conflict in Middle East and other parts of the world, where we saw almost unprecedented, on our television screens were people moving across the world, including to Australia, border security debates, human rights debates, and geopolitical strategic rivalries that we've all noticed escalate over the last 10, 15 years. on top of that, in the case of Papua New Guinea, was national mobility issues, our own internal migration, tribal fights in the highlands, sorcery violence, where people are also fleeing internal conflict or being displaced by climate change or natural disasters and so on. So this is an image I use in my work that kind of shows this flow of people who are coming into Australia, but who are forcefully directed into the Pacific. All along, we have the Australian Aid Program, which is talking about gender-based violence and so on in the Pacific. And just to qualify that, I'm only talking about Manus because that's where my focus is. Very importantly, of course, is the Nauru story, which I won't go in because I don't know enough about. So it began to become a bit, oh, wow. So you guys are saying gender violence, but on the one hand, you're doing this. You're talking about all the security, this fragile so-called failed state, but you're sending all these people up. What's going to happen to these people? So big questions were going on in my mind. But very, very importantly was the racialized, racist, and sexualized Australian discourse. Papua New Guinea is not safe, both on the human rights advocates and on the border sovereignty side. You can't send these people to Papua New Guinea because it's not safe for your asylum seekers, you know? Okay. And so they ended up only sending men, not women. And they sent this man to a small island. What do we do when we disrupt the social fabric of a community? Of course, there's going to be all kinds of upheaval when you put quite a significantly, proportionately large number of foreign men from a foreign culture into a local community. This is human. There's nothing here. But here it was presented as that's a hellhole. Papua New Guinea is a hellhole, and these people are going. It was acting also as a deterrent from anyone coming to Australia. If you come to Australia, you're going to go to that hellhole, and they'll kill you. So these brown, Middle Eastern, Asian people coming to Australia, they are a danger to this nice country. Send them to Papua New Guinea, to those cannibals and savages, and they'll fight each other over there. You know, it's really messed up, if you ask me. And the media discourse in Australia was quite horrible to be a Manus Islander or Pacific person living here during this period. So, you know, I am a little bit of an Excel nerd myself. I love spreadsheets. So I went through Australian media reports, 277 reports between 2012 and 2019 is when they kind of really decommissioned Manus Island. And these are kind of, what did these reports say about Manus Island and this detention center and gender-based violence? And so the purple color is everything that's about the traditional narrative, we're going to help Papua New Guinea fix gender-based violence. That's the purple color you can see that runs alongside. Those spike ones with the different colors are different stories about some kind of gendered violence or gendered dynamic or gendered alleged sexual assault on Manus Island directly relating to the asylum seeker detention center. Right? So in the first case, you had that big outcry about it's not a safe place to send asylum seekers to. It's not safe for women and so on. That second spike there, medium one, is when Reza Berati died, one of the asylum seekers. There was a big conflict between the locals and people in the asylum seeker, the detention center. And then this next group involves an alleged rape incident within the center. And so the stories range from sexual assault, alleged sexual assault within the center amongst detainees, or by the guards against the detainees, or by the guards or people working there against local women. And then as they, 2016, 2016, the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court ruled that this was unconstitutional. You couldn't just detain people forever without cause. And so people began to, they were let out of the detention center. So of course they interacted locally. And you had some great stories of love, and of course you have some not so good stories. And you're talking about people who have, I'm told I have 5 minutes and I can go on, so I better round up. So anyway, long and short, by the time we reached this end, 2019, you had men with very serious mental health problems who were in the local health community, who people in Australia were advocating to bring to Australia. And this is a quote from Peter Dutton, who was then Minister for Foreign Affairs, kind of arguing against these men being brought to Australia for medical treatment. Right? Let there be no doubt that this man sitting opposite me is not fit to be Prime Minister. It became a critical political issue in Australia. Right? He has taken the reckless course of action that we'll see coming from Manus Island. People who have been accused of sexual relationships with 14-year-old girls, alleged. Now, suddenly you had men you had sent to the island because they were a threat to your country. They need medical treatment, and then suddenly they are a threat to your country because they have allegedly committed sexual assault in the country you sent them to. Like, I just leave it with all of you to use your wisdom on that. There are good stories, beautiful stories, and this man here who's in the media, Udin, Spicy is his nickname, he came to Manus and fell in love with a Manus woman. And they found that he wasn't a refugee, so they sent him back to Bangladesh. So he returned via the Green Line there, came via Vanimo into Papua New Guinea and went back and found his woman. They put him back in jail, but the court said no, and they released him. So that's just the kind of story of human lives that we are talking about. And then I don't have time, I've gone over, but I think you get the drift of that. The next place I want to talk about is Port Moresby, and that again is a context where our countries are talking about upgrading and development and new property developments in the city and so forth, and yet at the same time we have big mass evictions. Like, we are talking about thousands of Papua New Guineans in the urban setting, and my focus is on Port Moresby, who have been evicted. I mean, like bulldozers. We wake up one morning and there's a bulldozer there basically bulldozing your community, the suburb we live in wherever we live. You don't belong to that land. And I follow the court cases on state land because state land is where, you know, we've been talking about relationality a lot in this, and state land is where land, of course, has been subsumed into the modern state system where there's a title holder. So when they go to the court privileges the title holder, and there's no policy in place to kind of protect those people who are being evicted. And some common themes throughout all of those court cases, again, reflecting the kind of dynamics we've been discussing throughout these conferences. On the one hand, people are expressing a Papua New Guinean way of living. They can't afford the big properties that are being sold in the city or rented, so they live in groups in informal settlements. And so you've got that tension between people working together, living together as a social group, but the courts recognize the state, the one person, the one company who owns that land, and a bit of a tension there. People work together and so forth, but in the process of that is the erasure or the increasing marginalization of the customary landowners, the original landowners or holders of Port Moresby area. So it's a very complex case of different claims to the land, but very important human rights issues, Indigenous people's rights to land, citizens' rights to housing, and so forth. And those are some policy stuff you can look at that I kind of outlined at some time ago. And that's a quote from one of the people. Basically, his point was, you know, when they have a natural disaster, or say climate change, for example, everyone will talk about it and send in the NGOs to assess the damage and to support. But when it comes to eviction, no one cares. And in fact, people are quite demonized by this process. The state and elites demonize people who live in settlements. And finally, I just wrap up. There are varying reasons for this harsh treatment. One is the courts recognize the title holder, but very sadly, what we've seen, it's always been there, but this year, for some reason, it's escalated. We saw a big eviction again earlier this year, and the politicians said this was because there was crime, law and order problems, and so they went in to fix it. The solution was eviction, not to strengthen the police to go and sort out law and order. So we have some very uncomfortable truths that our own leaders are saying to people to justify some of this. There's another thing that they say, go back home, go back to place bleu. They shouldn't be in the city. That's not always an option, not even for those of us sitting here. It's expensive. Some people are third, second generation, fourth generation living in the urban context. Where's home? Where's the cover circle? They've created new cover circles. So that's, those evictions just place more pressure on that sacred customary land, because where do people go when they are evicted? The city's in a state of flux. They go onto customary land, and that just adds more pressure on. The capital of Papua New Guinea has a boundary, but it's expanding. So as we go into the future, we're going to see some of this conflict. It already is there, because that's one of the case studies, spilling out into neighboring Central Province. And finally, Papua New Guinea included a Vagrancy Act. Now, this is a big debate in the country at the moment. What does it mean to be a vagrant in the country? So this targeting of poorer people, people who don't have the wherewithal to afford some of the modern things we all expect everyone to have, and under this law they can be excluded. So what do we mean by exclusion from a place in the Pacific? And then housing as a human right, but housing and the choice of housing to live in an informal settlement as a constitutionally protected expression of the way, Papua New Guinean way. All this valuation on Papua New Guinean ways of living, where does this story fit in? And I always challenge people who are lawyers, when is this going to become a constitutional issue? Because I believe it will be. And then finally, we've heard about mobility, climate change issues, and human mobility. Where does dignity fit in? We talked, our keynote speaker on Tuesday talked about dignity. Where does dignity fit in? And if we are talking about relocating people from around the Pacific to where, we have to fix up some of this kind of treatment of people in order to receive other people coming in. Emtasol, thank you very much, and sorry I went over.
Please welcome Dr. Alisi.
Malolele, and good morning to you all. Fatap ke o tua ko afio taulo o tonga. Fatap ke tonga toketa unga te kata fonua o ki tau fatahap makau taki ko toa ki o tau loto tonga he ahoni. My name is Alisi. I'm from Tonga. I work in Samoa. And on Tuesday, I heard very clearly and received this exhortation from Honorable Fiame about rethinking development in the Pacific. And my focus has been more on the rethinking side. I think this is very much a call for us academics, for us in policy making, to rethink, to engage in that process of reimagining and recalibrating our thinking about development. I feel like this is the only way we can avoid falling into the trap of complacency and really making sure that our research, our policies are actually responsive and effective. And so this is kind of the approach that I've taken with this presentation. My apologies to Ryan in advance in case I go off topic. I tend to overthink when I rethink, but hopefully this will contribute to our effort to try and foster development in the region. So I work for PACER Plus, and for those of you who don't know what PACER Plus is, it's a trade agreement. And this is a comprehensive regional trade agreement between the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. It's comprehensive in the sense that it covers all trade areas, including trade in goods, trade in services, investment, and labor mobility. It's not a conventional free trade agreement, so we're not just about rules-based trade. We're also looking at how we can foster and help countries increasingly participate in trade, as well as optimize and utilize opportunities for trade to increase development in their countries. And so we also acknowledge the funding that is provided by the governments of Australia and New Zealand in this effort. The agreement was signed in 2017, ratified in 2020. There are 10 parties to this agreement, and I've given the countries here. The only countries that are still work in progress is Fiji and PNG, and we're hoping that they can also join very soon. And when it comes to labor mobility in the context of PACER Plus, there are two specific areas that we, or frameworks that we use. One is the arrangement on labor mobility. So this is an annex, a non-legally binding annex to the PACER Plus agreement. And it's a regional framework for labor mobility cooperation amongst the parties to PACER Plus. Our key focus is not about moving people. Our focus is on the development impact, especially the development benefits for Pacific countries, and more so Pacific labor-sending countries. We also have what's called the Temporary Movement of Natural Persons chapter. And this is the more trade side of labor mobility that's focusing more on facilitating the movement of service providers for trade and services. But in the sense of bringing it under a legally binding trade framework, it's mostly just focused on highly skilled professionals. And so we tend to use these two frameworks to look at how we can leverage the opportunities in regional labor mobility to support development in the Pacific. And the pilot that Ryan had referred to, initially when we were talking about labor mobility, and I think this is kind of like the sense around the region, it's always about moving people from the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. In 2022, our office was just set up. But one of our key activities is this event called the Pacific Labor Mobility Annual Meeting. And this is kind of like the key regional forum for labor mobility in the region. And we heard in that meeting the voice of Cook Islands and Niue, who said it's not just about Australia and New Zealand. There's also key and stringent labor shortages within Pacific countries that needs to be addressed. And in 2022, we recognized in that meeting New Zealand, Cook Islands and Niue as labor receiving countries who are needing labor to come into their countries. And so we started based on the directive from our parties and especially from the Niuean government on a need to look at how we can facilitate that intra-Pacific labor mobility to address shortages, labor shortages, skill shortages within countries in the Pacific. And what we identified was this in our talks with our different countries. Solomon Islands, they have a retirement age of 55. And so there's this, in Niue on the other hand, the retirement age is 60. And so in Solomon Islands, because of their rapid population growth, they have reduced their retirement age. And so there's this pool of very able, very active, and healthy retired nurses who are not finding employment, but they're still able and very employable. And so Niue was saying, we need them, we want them. And so we were able to facilitate this pilot not for the middle-aged nurses, but for the retired Solomon Islander nurses to move and work in Niue in the aged care facility. And so within this pilot, it was launched in 2024, and it was under this interagency agreement between the two governments of Solomon Islands and Niue. And we have, under that pilot, which is only for 6 months, ended August of last year, moved 5 nurses. So Niue is a very small country. They only needed 5. And so we were able to pilot with 5. And then we did a final evaluation of that pilot in September of last year. And both governments agreed that it was an effective approach to managing a managed labor mobility scheme within the Pacific. And now we're in the process of adopting the learnings from that pilot to develop a labor mobility strategy for Niue. Not going to focus on the pilot today. Like I said, I'm in the mission of rethinking all of this and to looking at how we can improve policies for development. And I think to make intra-Pacific labor mobility or any kind of labor mobility to actually work for the Pacific, we have to understand the why, the key drivers behind Pacific labor mobility. One is labor shortages. So there are countries in the Pacific that do not have enough bodies to work and support development. One example is Cook Islands and, of course, Niue, as I mentioned before. Their populations, because of their partnership with New Zealand, their free association with New Zealand, since the 1970s, their population has significantly declined. Niue's population, for example, reduced from 5,000 in 1974, when they signed on to the free association, to only 1,600 in 2022. So they don't have enough people to work and address the labor shortages in their countries. And it's important to also differentiate between labor shortages and skill shortages. There are also countries in the Pacific who may have people, but they don't have the right skills to meet the needs of their own local private sector. And so we did a study in 2023 in Tonga. And one of the key findings here is that Tonga is not really facing a labor shortage, it's facing a skill shortage. And there were key shortages that were identified from that study, and it's specifically in the medium to high skilled level in almost across all sectors, especially for accountants, engineers, IT technicians, teachers, medical professionals, and even policy analysts. And so the population was there, the workforce was there, they didn't have the right skills. And so the question is why? And so because of this, there's also countries who have, because of their rapid population growth, they have the population, they may have also the skills, but they don't have the employment opportunities. And so countries like Solomon Islands, for example, they have a population growth of 2.7% per year. That's higher than the annual average of 1%. And that's also higher than the regional average of 1.5%. And so you can imagine that in Solomon Islands, their population, especially the high school leavers, are unable to find employment. And so they need to move to find employment. And so you have this uneven distribution of labor and skills, and we need to facilitate through labor mobility the movement from where there is supply to where there is demand. The other key driver that we need to understand is that across all of the countries in the Pacific, there is a rising demand from private sector as well as from public sector for job-ready skilled workers across all sectors. And these, from our experience, were identified as the key drivers. And we need to understand, if we are to make labor mobility effective, we have to understand these key drivers. And today, I want to just focus on one, and this is the skill shortage. And our work in PACER Plus has identified across all of the areas in trade, trading goods, trade and services, is that skill shortages is now becoming a binding constraint on economic growth in the region. We have increasingly seeing these signs. In every country that we go into a hotel, this big sign on the front. We're not able to deliver this service because there's no workers. Or we're not able to work on these specific days because we don't have enough staff. And so across the Pacific, this is what we're finding. Employers are not struggling to find workers. they are struggling to find the right skills. And so the question for us is why? And so again, from our studies, from our work with our parties in PACER Plus, we find that there's multiple pressures, multiple factors that cause this skills shortage. It's not just about the temporary movement of workers under the PALM and RSE scheme. We also acknowledge that permanent migration, and especially for countries that have that opportunity to access, even freely access countries like Australia and New Zealand, it's removing skilled and semi-skilled workers at scale. And then there's also persistent skills gaps, which reflects perhaps weak alignment between education, training, with the actual needs, the actual skills needs of private sector, domestic private sector in the countries. We also found that there are weak incentives. There are working conditions, so these are intrinsic labor market structural issues that are not actually encouraging workers, but more or less discouraging, especially the youth, to enter into the domestic labor markets. And so they are, as soon as they graduate, they're keen to look elsewhere and not so much into their own countries. And when it comes to PALM and RSE temporary labor mobility schemes, we find that there's a skills mismatch. We have highly skilled workers who are going to work in low-skilled jobs under PALM and RSE. So you have lawyers, accountants, who are going to work and picking fruits. And you wonder why. So there's a recruitment issue also there. And then you have the demographic issues. So in some countries, there is a decline. Fertility rates have reduced. And so the future skills pipeline is also an issue. And then this is perhaps a point of discussion with key academics also, but remittances, especially the increase in remittances, which is one of the key gains from labor mobility, the increase of remittances flowing into the Pacific may also be creating this environment or this culture of dependency that is causing people to not want to work because they are constantly receiving money from overseas for consumption. And so these are some of the key factors that we're taking into consideration. And I think we need to consider. It's when we're wanting to make labor mobility beneficial for the Pacific and to increase the development benefits of labor mobility for Pacific countries, we need to understand these factors and what affects the development benefits of labor mobility. It's not just about moving people. We need to understand also the structural, the incentive issues, those factors that are affecting the flow of development and capital back to support development in the countries. And so in the spirit of rethinking and recalibrating our thinking about development, I have some thoughts that I wanted to share with you on how the PALM scheme and even Australia can perhaps help to address this issue. It's a pilot that I'm kind of thinking about and have talked to some of my colleagues. It's about Pacific Skills Mobility Partnership within PALM and thinking perhaps starting with tourism. So tourism is one of the key sectors that is constantly making this issue that they're losing workers, they're losing skills, they don't have enough skills, and it's becoming a very binding constraint on one of the key growth sectors in the Pacific across of our countries. So maybe this is a good place to start. So what is this? What we're proposing is to design and deliver a mutually beneficial development-centered labor mobility initiative. And basically what this means is perhaps creating a pathway for apprenticeship within the PALM scheme. And this is very much about skills. With the current, policy setting for PALM, there's many opportunities for skills training, but it's very much about the skills needs of employers in Australia. What we're proposing is perhaps we can also engage the private sector in the Pacific, and in this pilot, perhaps start with tourism, and bring the employers in Australia, New Zealand, and the private sector hotel operators in the Pacific to talk about what are the key skills needs. Because a lot of times you will find that their skills needs match. And so in those commonalities, we can create an apprenticeship program. It's almost like the scholarship programs for Australia Awards coming in for 3 years to work at ANU. But we flip that into perhaps turning the 4-year PALM scheme into an apprenticeship program. And so the idea is that, again, this is very much a concept. Perhaps we can select employers from those countries to start talking about agreed skills outcomes and how to address those skills gaps. And then the employers in the Pacific can select workers, and they can be contracted not only to the employer that they're going to work in Australia and New Zealand, but also contract them to their own employers in the Pacific, so that when they complete their 3-year, they're able to go back and transfer their skills and help the development of those tourism operators. And so it's going to be very much about skills, and it's about partnership. It requires partnership. And this partnership is not just about the two countries. It's also bringing in the key stakeholders who are involved in skills. It's not just about the private sector. It's also about the training institutions. It's about the qualifications authorities, so that we can start talking about skills anticipation, skills training, skills recognition in both Australia as well as in the Pacific, so that we're able to facilitate that transfer of skills, and not just any skills, but the skills that are needed by the private sector in both sides of the labor mobility process. And so this is what the concept looks like in my head right now. It's about cooperation. So it really needs to be designed collaboratively between private sector in both sending and receiving ends. It needs to be skills-based, so it's about the skills needs of those employers. And then it becomes a training program where there's a continuum of a suite of training before workers depart countries, while they're working overseas, and also when they return, and therefore, amplifying their skill set and supporting development. But it requires that focus on skills and engaging the people who know what skills training is, and understand how skills recognition, skills training can work, not just for Australia and New Zealand, but also for the Pacific. And then, like I said before, there's a need for skills recognition. We found that there's a lot of workers who are going overseas. They're getting a lot of training. They're acquiring skills. But a lot of those skills are not recognized. They're not recognized in Australia, and they're not recognized back in the Pacific. There is a process for skills recognition. And so there is a need for us to also take that into consideration in the design of this kind of pilot. And I think also, like I said, with the contracting and binding the workers to go back and work in their countries, we can look at increasing labor market integration and integration of skills for development. So I just want to leave that concept with you to continue thinking about. I think this is a subject for further conversation, but it would be good to bring like-minded people to that forum to start thinking, not just about thinking and discussing theories, but actually translating those ideas into real action that can work and benefit the Pacific. So with that, I leave it with you as food for thought. Thank you.
Since I was holding up my hand with time for them, I'm just going to set myself one that's a bit shorter, because I do not deserve as much time as these two. So I've got some notes that I'm not going to stick to, though. So I'm mostly going to use my 15 to 20 minutes here that I have to talk, give a bit of a stock take on Pacific to Australia migration. So the idea was to start with looking really closely within our closest neighbour, then starting intra-region, and then Alicia has perfectly connected that up to where I'm going to go now. So yeah, my name's Ryan. I'm Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre. Been here since about 2019. As far as positionality goes as well, this is where I work, but I'm very much an immigrant child. My parents both came here from one of the few countries that remains colonised by Britain, coming from different factions. And my children were both born not in Australia. My positionality is that I'm actually a big believer in the free movement of people to go and live and work and love wherever they like. But I'll continue on from there. So where are we at so far? About 1.4% of the Australian population has Pacific heritage and comes from the Pacific. That's not the same as the current share of migrants, though, which Australians massively overestimate. When you ask Australians out there in the public, they think there's 3 times as many Pacific migrants in our migration intake as there really is. What about Palm Scheme workers? Right now, there's, as of the latest data that DUA has released, 32,500 workers currently in the country. This accounts for about 1% of current temporary visas on issue at the moment. And PEV? It's supposed to be about 3,000 a year, but we know from Stephen's talk how many visas have been issued so far. And if we issued all of those 3,000, we'd be at about 1% of our permanent intake. 1%. So let's let that number stay in your head throughout my talk for a bit. I wanted to identify some themes today. I don't normally do that. As an economist, I'll normally be like, here's my method, here's my results, but I'm trying to do a little bit of my own, I'm sorry, Naya Hamui, a little bit of my own weaving in the talk. And I identified 3. The first one sits really tightly within Palm. It's this tension that we're seeing in the need and the want of many Pacific countries for more growth, notably PNG, SOLS, and TL and others, versus the regulatory tightening here and welfare protections that have been in place. Growth of Palm has massively stalled and seasonal numbers continue to decline. And this is largely due to compliance costs rising and demands on the workers, demands on the employers. The second tension is the one that Alicia brought us back to as well, which is the rethinking, the real tensions that we see within the region. Persistent concerns, issues around brain drain, brawn drain, care drain, any type of drain you can think of, and social costs, and the fact that Australia and New Zealand are the ones holding the pen on these schemes and therefore sovereignty issues. But at the same time, the policies that are being put in place to respond to these domestic concerns, some of them don't have teeth. The Samoan quota is many orders of magnitude around a cap that would be realised and the current numbers. And we're still seeing leader after leader come forward in support of freer movement and visa-free travel. So there's a gap here between what needs to be said to appease the domestic politics and where we seem to be going. And then the third one is, of course, the Australian politics. Here we have perhaps the largest anti-immigration sentiment we've ever seen in this country at the moment, the rise of One Nation. The last election, as most of you will remember, was largely silent on Pacific migration, unlike the one before that. And so there's a real question here about what the social licence still remains domestically on those issues. So first, going from growth to stagnation. This is the history of the 2 main schemes with Australia. The first, the seasonal worker program, and then the Pacific Labour Scheme, now together, merged together as the PALM, but I have kept them separate here because they are very different. One of them is full-time and one of them is seasonal, and these sectors are really different in the demand side. And so what you see here is kind of really, really steady growth up to 2020 in seasonal workers. Once you sort of fade out in your mind a little bit the pandemic, because things got really noisy there as people were kept in the country and redeployed and so forth. But then I guess the key point there is that the peak was at around 34,000 and now we're down to 32. And within that 32, there's a swapping happening. So seasonal and short terms continue to decline and longer terms continue to increase in here. And basically, it seems like this previous growth era of the 2010s is behind us now without reform. We're seeing employer after employer walk away from the scheme, and people are shifting back to backpackers. So I'll talk a little bit about why that's happened. So in 2023, was the main policy change as the program was moved from DFAT over into DUA, and the new deed and agreements raised the costs of participation across several margins, not just the financial costs, but the time costs. There's a lot of uncertainty there, right? Like uncertainty places a big cognitive tax on people. And at the same time as this, after the borders reopened, backpackers were back. I'm not Backstreet Boy line there. And they're far less regulated. It's really the Wild West out there in terms of the backpacker labour market. And these two factors together, and basically a lot of the teething issues within the department meant that often recruitment timelines were now double what the standard was. And if you're dealing with trying to bring people over for a couple of months and you have to have everything booked 2 months in advance for accommodation in regional Australia, you can think of the frictions that places on you as a small farm or even larger one, but it's the small ones that would be much less well prepared to deal with these frictions and costs. Anyway, here's a figure from DUA. Rather than take my word for it, you can take the department's word from it that they produced. So here you can see in the months sort of the flatlining, but then really the break that happened whenever the new deed was put in place. Just a few weeks ago, they'd released new guidelines as well. I've done a careful comparison of these, and I do regret to inform you that there is not much in there that is likely to make it easier and more attractive for employers to participate in the scheme. There's additional regulations, but one thing that has stuck is that there was going to be a transition towards tightening up the hours requirement such that every employer and seasonal worker was de facto providing full-time hours every week, but that has been relaxed to allow seasonal averaging, which was sort of a backstep that the government took whenever people started protesting that in the seasonal sector. So that's stuck, which seems okay. On the supply side, there's also been a lot of uncertainty. There was quite a surge in protection visa applications from palm workers and people leaving the scheme and not applying for protection visas as well, though this disengagement number is now down considerably from its peak, well, at least so we're told. And of course, there's the brain drain politics, right? We see a lot of this in sending countries that leads to these tensions and these policy stabilities, sending country reviews that have happened, and basically it makes it really hard for employers here to plan what they're going to do when there's a lot of policy volatility in terms of what's happening, in terms of making your investment decisions and what happens going forward. I'm trying not to use too much economics jargon. But when you've got both sides tightening up and turning up the dial on the volatility and on the uncertainty, that makes it makes it harder to invest, right? And that brings us back, I guess, to the tensions. There's two competing narratives on palm, but they don't necessarily need to compete, right? Where we probably want to be, it's often the case that two things can be true at once. We often need to find a balance. The headlines have been dominated by exploitation concerns, demanding more regulation. At the same time, we know that the development gains have been pretty massive, and these are among the largest opportunities available to the Pacific countries. Worker protections need to be in place, and at the same time, the more we put in place with them, then it pushes away employers and that demand falls. So there's a balance there. And every compliance cost increment that we do have is pushing the gap between backpackers and palm workers in terms of attractiveness wider and wider and wider. And this is precisely sort of what we're seeing with the numbers. I'll keep moving. So onto some evidence that we have, just to sort of ground the discussion on palm a little bit in the data that we do have. In terms of earnings, this is now quite well known, but this is from some of our data. Typically, the earnings premium from people coming over is between 3 and 10 times what they earned in their employment before moving. And this depends on what the sending country labour market earnings are. So as you move from, say, Polynesia, where earnings tend to be a little bit higher over to Melanesia, you're moving from that 3 or 4 up to 10. And one thing that I don't think is quite well appreciated is just the extent of savings that people do make. On the averages and across the data, when you take a bigger picture view of it, a lot is, people tend to send the same amount back home to support their families, but an awful lot is cumulatively saved and remitted. If you include the savings onto that, it's about 60% of earnings. And we see this sort of consistently across schemes and on average across schemes. There's always a distribution, but on average we see this. And then when you ask people what their views are on it, here I'm talking not us elite academics and policymakers that tend to dominate the discussions, but households in the region. So these numbers come from a representative survey of non-migrant sending households in 3 sending countries. And when you see these figures up here, the darker orange is how they view the schemes in terms of the benefits for their community. And it's overwhelmingly positive, right? And we also asked workers in our large, so it was we did a survey of about 2,000 workers. The second round of it is about to hit the field now. And more than 9 out of 10 still want to come back again and again and again. And about 7% express some form of dissatisfaction, and that would come to the areas that you would all know about, accommodation issues, issues around visa rules and so forth. Then what about on the Australian side? Well, we've got one paper that we wanted to take the domestic side seriously. So we used all the tax records and visa records in the Australian data lab at the ABS to study the scale up and the rollout of the seasonal worker program. And basically we found no evidence of wage suppression of local lower skilled workers or farm workers in there. But then when we look specifically at the areas and the jobs that they are filling, it does turn out that they are filling genuine gaps. These are sectors and positions and regions that have had secular decline over quite a while. And then I guess the last point on the Australia side and the evidence is Pacific migration is actually more supported than the rest of the broad immigration program. You hear the opposition leader the other night, maybe last night on the news saying, oh, 2/3 of Australians want the number of the total immigration intake reduced. If you just focus on the total, that picks up a lot of other things. It's not actually how you feel about immigration. If you ask more specific questions about skills, countries, sectors, students, you get very different findings. So we did this in a study with some of our colleagues, and one of our disaggregations was by country and region and type. And for the PEV, for the Tuvalu Agreement, for Pacific temporary and permanent migration, much more supported than the rest of the Australian migration program. But where that is coming from is actually a place of not knowing all that well, because we embedded an information experiment in this, and actually telling people about housing concerns or the need for construction workers didn't do anything for people's views and support for Pacific migration, but rather giving them better information on what the current shares were and how they were overestimating the number of Pacific migrants in Australia did estimate it. So giving them more factual information from a low baseline was actually what shifted views here. The Australian public is not particularly well informed, and for these questions we got many more don't know, not sure answers as opposed to their actual preferences than we did for the rest of the migration program. Yeah, I shouldn't have spent too much time on there. So the second tension now, I guess, is the rethinking issue, the discourse. So there's persistent domestic discourse within some Pacific countries, I'm not going to say all, about the costs and the risks of labour mobility. And we get some of these a lot of discussion on this on the blog as well, and these concerns extend well beyond brain drain. The way to really think about it, I think, as Alicia helped make clear, is you need to be precise. We need to be tractable and think about specific sectors, skills, countries, places, really have good data on those mismatches to make good policy in this area. And this isn't just an academic debate, but we know that it has been shaping policy. One of the most pointed criticisms, which might have been a year or two ago, was from PM Fiame's last visit, where she was saying the idea of not really liking the idea of Pacific nations as outposts growing people. And at the same time, we heard her talk the other day that drew out these tensions really well, and at the same time supported free movement at the end in various ways. So there's real tensions here, and we do see this tide towards free movement still happening. And one way that I found interesting is, rather than stated preferences, what people are sort of saying and have to say for the politics, look at the revealed preferences of what countries actually do. Second year of PEV, the countries that pulled out for these reasons have all joined. The caps that are in place will not be reached anytime in the foreseeable future, so they're not that meaningful. 5 minutes left for me. And yeah, so here's just a chart from my colleague Richard Curtin, it's on both sides, that does show the extent of the male population that's abroad. And these are huge numbers. And so part of the way that I've been thinking about the distribution of the discourse across countries is it's primarily coming from those where the workers are a lot of workers are overseas, and the ones that have been more exposed. And so what this has led to now is, I can skip this part here because you all read the blog. But what that has led to now has been diversification in sending countries and competition. So as some countries have faced domestic issues and other countries have entered the fray, we have seen a shift away from Vanuatu, Tonga as primary sending countries, and really the rise of TL, Fiji, and Solomon Islands. Did I say PNG? Fiji. PNG wants to rise and is rising and will rise, but I think that's the case there. But this competition has meant that countries that wanted to grow could still grow, while others contracted. But that space now is quickly becoming exhausted without any more aggregate growth, and the shift towards longer term ones, because many countries would rather be sending people circularly and for short stints rather than for the 3 or 4 years that require family separation. And this is where the growth is at the moment. It's not in the seasonal sector. Thanks to Natasha and Stephen, you guys all know a lot about the PEV and now the Fellow Mobility Pathway. The other day I recognised, I'm just kidding, I don't recognise all the faces in here from that talk. But these are probably the two biggest changes in terms of Australian policy. It brings in place a permanent pathway, and the motivations for this have been developed throughout the 2010s by governments of both stripes, and it was partly due to the climate concerns, but also the fact that the pathway to Australia has largely been through New Zealand and through the skills stream and through these temporary schemes. And the skills stream, does anyone in the room know which country dominates the skills stream and why? Historically, it was only Fiji. So skilled migration to Australia, to the Pacific, has always been available because our migration system is incredibly skill biased. So people have always been able to take a skilled path. But these newer ones tend to be either lower skilled or skill neutral in theory. Whether they are skill neutral in practice is a different question, and I would encourage you to read Natasha's work on this and Aka's. But the main difference between these two, which I think is going to be an interesting one to watch in the coming years, is that the PEV requires people to find a job in order to get their visa issued, and the Tuvalu one does not. And you don't actually need to get the visa and use it and be in the country working for it to be in place. It doesn't have this use it or lose it feature that most of our visas do have. These visas were incredibly popular. Some challenges, but they're being navigated reasonably well, I think. And they primarily relate to the job search frictions and the fact that our Department of Home Affairs is not used to having a visa where they need to get them through and issue them. Normally, if you don't submit the documents or have the documents or make a typo, they'll just reject it without and not give you a call back. Whereas this one was a slightly different kettle of fish for them to understand and find a new way of working. So on to Australia's domestic politics. So in 2022, that was kind of the election where Labor brought in some big Pacific migration reforms in introducing the PEV, introducing family accompaniment under the PALM scheme as a pilot, only under the long one, and abandoning the agricultural visa proposal, which was being really actively debated at the time. In a way, this ushered in a new era of Pacific labour mobility, moving from just circularity to these moving closer to migration with dignity, although if you contrast the PEV and Tuvalu in there, it's very clear which one of them has the dignity lens attached to it, and less so. Then fast forward to 2025. We didn't hear anything about Pacific migration from Labor during this election, while the coalition wanted to bring back the ag visa and had threatened to abolish the PEV after already voting against the supportive legislation that allowed for the ballot to happen and the services to all be provided. So the election likely saved the PEV, but it's quite clear now that the political energy, at least at the ministerial level and what we see in the media, that led to the conditions for these pathways to be created is not there anymore, right? We're not seeing this same thing. And so the tension here is that we've got these genuine sort of path-breaking policies that have been put in place and real achievements, and the future of them in some ways is politically uncertain. And the same old problems do seem to persist. So Palm now is struggling with growth. The backpacker reforms have not happened because they're so politically costly. And we still do see the asylum disengagement issue out there in the field. It's improving, but it's still a problem, and they're cumulative, right? As people have disbanded, many are still in the country. My boss, Professor Howes, put forward a blog a while back suggesting some priorities for the new government, being to bed down PEV, end family separation, find a way to rescue Palm, address the asylum issue, and come up with some bold new initiatives. So I've given them a score so far, a progress score here. I won't be taking questions on my scores. Just kidding. But if you're wondering, the 2 for the reform one is the having a little bit more flexibility around the hours issue, which our survey showed that when you consider the distribution of hours between seasonal workers and full-time workers, it was actually not that common systematically across the big sample workers for them to be getting not that many hours. And so my concern as an economist is when you then homogenise that and crunch it up, you lose the tail. You lose people that are trying to earn a lot and really benefit from the surges of the seasonal sector. And I think that is what has largely happened. So that's a welfare loss. And so where should we go to from here? This picture was just about, I'll use an anecdote rather than the picture. Right now, imagine you're in the Palm scheme, you're at a big site just outside of Brisbane, you're on a Palm short 1-year visa. It's your first time. Your colleague next to you is on a multi-year visa. They can come back and go. Your other colleague from the same country has got their family with them because they're part of the family accompaniment pilot. And your other colleague has just won the PEV and so now can stay in a country. And you've got one other colleague who is sponsored by the employer for a skilled visa. You're all working together under the same employer, extremely different conditions on your visas and your rights. And if anyone's dealt with the Australian immigration system, even when you're trying to do something simple, it's not that simple. It's confusing at the best of times, even if you hold a PhD, let alone for everyday people out there. And so there's a need at the moment to sort of simplify this, and we are seeing the visas all sort of conflate together. Sponsorship for other visas, onshore PEV applications, there's a new workplace justice visa, and this number here from the PEV, it's now changed as we saw in Alison Carrington's talk the other day. So the 192 is the PEV visa. So when people applied for their PE visa after winning the lottery, this is the visas that those who already held visas had in hand. So already the 403, Palm visas, 500 was the students, 482, temporary skills, bridging. So they're already applying from other ones, and as we know from Tasha's, people who were already in Australia and on these other visas were much more able to get an employment offer and convert. So where should we go? I've tried to do what I was promising before and find a way to simplify it. And so I'll offer here a vision for everyone to react to and push back on as much as they wish, which is for the short scheme, I think we should keep it seasonal, circular, with limited portability. That's a controversial remark, but employers have to spend a bit to get people over. And so once you remove that, then it becomes no different to the backpacker visa, right? And optimise for short work. Make this distinct from the Palm long one, which remains open across sectors, not seasonal, full-time, portability after a couple of months or a year. People can then go and work for any Palm employer, and after 3 to 4 years, a permanent pathway if someone wishes that. Because right now, that's happening de facto. It's happening through unmanaged pathways. And families, we've already had a very successful family accompaniment pilot. I believe there was not many adverse findings from that study, and I think it's high time to extend the rights to bring family over and not discriminate in that regard. Which then brings us over to the permanent visas. At the moment, they're skill neutral and a random ballot. That's important, that's innovative, and that people do get full access to labour market government services. I think it should stay that way. So with those 3 different classes, there's 3 principles there, right? We need to formalise the pathways off them, an off-ramp, so that we don't just see this sort of ad hoc coping strategy. We need to have clear incentives and predictability. So as I think Elise was mentioning, I'm suggesting the other way. The pilot would send people back home, but we also need a PALM graduation skills path that allows people to stay should they wish to, that allows them to build the skills and be competitive for the rest of the migration program or to stay with their current employer rather than do the repeat dance, because these workers are filling long-term jobs, structural needs, and that's the basic they need. If you've moved overseas for 1 year, let alone 4, you're upheaving your whole life for that and moving, and you've practically moved. And so you shouldn't have to do that back and forward, in my view. I think the integrity of the main PEV features should be preserved, and all of this sits within, I think, a social license challenge that we do need to be perceived. Hamui opened with this, actually, that with all of the current politics that we're seeing, the rise of One Nation, migration does need to be perceived as under control in order to retain a social license. We know this from the political science and the migration literature studies all over the world. And this is, I think, one of the key threats. For PALM, the disengagement and the PALM workers who are no longer PALM workers that have dominated a lot of the domestic discourse and reporting on this have been a real threat to the reputation and the validity of the scheme, for good reason. So where to from here? I would like to see PALM rescued and get back to a place of growth with dignity and protections. And the way to do this, I think, is not getting rid of protections, but really simplifying it and just making it a bit easier for the employers that are participating and reforming the backpacker visa to address the competition issue. We no longer need area restrictions because that's highly unequal. We have a carve-out for meat, but we don't have one for aged care, yet most of the demand for aged care is in cities, and so I think we shouldn't be not allowing people to live near their friends and families in the cities. That's the second one that would help to address demand. And there's other sectors that, although the scheme was conceived to be sector neutral, that's not how it has played out in practice. Employers go and create new ABNs for each sector that they're working in and so forth. They have sub-ones. So basically bringing it back to being sector neutral, and then what that would mean, I think, will be also opening it up to trades, to the skills that are in demand in Australia, but then also back in the Pacific. A lot of money goes back into construction and building and so forth, and there's a real gap there. On the permanent pathways, yeah, there's a lot of questions there as to will Fa'alapeli become the new standard? Should it be extended to other nations? What should happen with the current quotas? And I will end with the freer movement question. So it's firmly now on the PIF's agenda, and there's a working group there that has been passed forward, and we heard at the Pacific Update last year the Secretary General speak quite strongly on this, and we now see most leaders across the region calling for at least visa-free travel. New Zealand's embarrassed us on this front, and Australia can at least, I think, match what New Zealand has done. But in terms of regionalism and the movements there, I think, yeah, I'm very supportive of continued incrementalism, which is more productive bilateral engagements, really working hard and thinking hard on the qualification, unification and transferability issue across countries, and supporting Elise's team to expand their pilot work within the region, which is, I think, equally, if not more important than the stuff with us. But thanks for letting me have the floor for so long. I've tried to put together a few little boxes that might weave together what we've been talking about separately. But yeah, I would like to please invite now my other two panelists down and take all questions from you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank yourselves, the panelists, for very informative sessions. My question is to yourself, Dr. Ryan. Right. Do you think if you had Australians who were living in the cities go back to the fruit-picking places in the regional areas, and you were able domestically to fill those jobs, would we be talking about labour mobility from the Pacific?
That's a very precise question. So I would say if there was not demand for the jobs initially, then we wouldn't have had, I think, the SWP exists, or now the PLS, or Palm Long. But at the same time, I think that around 2018 and 19, the geopolitical conditions that led to the rise of Pacific labour mobility largely may well have happened with only a little bit of those demand conditions. Those political conditions I don't think are as strong now as they were before. So I think demand is needed. But on the question of Australians going back, one thing that we see in the data is that most of the regions and the sectors where the jobs have been in long-term sectoral and structural decline, and seasonal work is a particularly interesting one because these are not positions that are needed for the whole year, and so for people to then move within the country for relatively low-skilled work, people don't, and they haven't been able to fill it, which is why it's, I think, before the SWP, largely been backpackers and other migrants doing the jobs. And so there's a question there of, well then, do you just pay them more to get them to come out? And wages in the region, I mean, it's the same, our industrial relations framework does have basically fixed pay by sectors across countries, things are pretty consistent. But I did have something to add on that, but I've now forgotten. There was something else to add there on the page. Oh no, it's not going to be people that would be making the jobs redundant. It's going to be machines. Australian agriculture is not mechanising at the rate that the US or even New Zealand has been, and so yeah, that's what I was going to add. That people are not going to go back. Australia is continuing to it's been rapidly urbanising for decades, and we have many declining regions and towns where the population both has been falling, but then the ag workforce as well has also been constantly falling, and the wages there are no different to in the ABS they count them as labour occupations. It's no less, and in many cases it's more because of peace rates and so forth. But yeah.
Sorry, I think I didn't put it well. What I was saying that, of course, you were saying that those things, you're not going to have Australians go back because you have those things that you were explaining. But since that is the reality, and our islands are bringing the workforce, filling in that gap, I guess that's my point. But I think if they did not have that gap, or question, if that gap was not there, I'm not saying that it's bad, because as you have just said, 3 times the economy, page saving, I do have a little, anyway, I'm just saying that gap we are filling in from our islands, but the gap is in Australia.
Yes, and that gap is only being partially filled by these 2 schemes, right? Most of the workers are immigrants on other visas, or contracted labour, contracted domestic labour, at least in terms of horticulture. So it's not a negligible share, but it's far from the majority. I think we can go one at a time. It's more of a conversation, but please spread the questions around. I've done too much talking already. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to add on to the question about the gap, whether you had also considered the gap that's also at home, the gap within our families, within our communities. So when you're taking, or when our men are actually applying for these roles and also being upskilled, how does that come back to us? Because as someone who's actually lived through it, we send money back home as well to help pay for these bills. But at the same time, we're relying on our men to maintain our farms as well at home, our plantations. So then when they're also applying for these roles, there's no one there to actually maintain our livelihood there too. So whether you've also considered that in terms of bringing back, and also just going back to the last session that we had was with the weaving, and making sure that there's something that stays back home as well, or comes back home. Thank you.
There was a lot there, which I would be inclined to just take as a comment and say, yes, absolutely, considered. And I think, that's important to create, to take the whole picture. A plug for our new research, though, at least we'll be doing the second round of this large 7-country survey at the moment. And there's a lot of new parts in there on skills transfer and on reintegration. And one thing that we're trying to capture better is what you would call the spillovers, but they're not necessarily positive, right? Previously, it's been well documented, sort of the household and the individual level impacts, but how measuring and understanding how that percolates through the community and the broader economy is not something that has been well done yet at all and is not well understood. So we're trying to fill that gap at the moment, which I think partially speaks to this issue. But it's very complicated. It's hard to do in an analytically rigorous way because there's just so much going on there in terms of the development piece attached to that.
I guess just to add, from a Pacific perspective, in terms of understanding this gap. So when we're talking gap, we're talking about the demand, and I think we need to understand why there is that gap in order to understand the issues better. I think here in Australia, and it's the case also in New Zealand, it is an aging demographic, and so you find that there is demand for young, able people to fill those shortages, labor shortages. And some of the work there is also, we found that from research, and a lot of Australians might not want to work in those sectors. And so the gap is quite prominent. And so that's why Australia and New Zealand looked into these schemes in the first place, because it wasn't being filled domestically. And the Pacific put up their hands to address that gap. I think just to add about the gap back in the Pacific, I think I want to emphasize that it's not just about Australia and New Zealand, it is about partnership. In the beginning, when Pacific countries put up their hand to address this labor shortage in Australia and New Zealand, it was just about numbers. It was just about sending people without really understanding the repercussions back at home and understanding the development side of labor mobility. And so it's about cooperation and really helping, I think, not just the ministry or the unit, which is the labor mobility unit in the Pacific that's sending workers, but it's about that ecosystem in the Pacific, including NGOs, government departments responsible for development, women, community agencies, training institutions, to really come together and understand what is the gap that's caused back at home, and how can we work together to address those. So again, I think we tend to point the finger, you taking workers out. No, we sent workers over. And so we need to take responsibility as well, and to understand how we can work with the governments of Australia and New Zealand within our own countries to address the issues back home. Thanks.
I'm cognizant of time, but any further questions? Any hands? Otherwise, I'm going to ask one of you, Naya Hamuli, as I'll abuse my privilege as the panel chair. So in my talk, I did mention how should the different Pacific visa pathways relate to one another, but if we would broaden that out to how do these different forms of mobility, in much more general terms, the rights of the individuals, temporary movements, permanent resettlements, intra-regional movements, displacement, relate to one another in policy terms. Do you think there is a coherent architecture here, or are we inevitably dealing with different pressures, ad hoc responses? How can we have sort of a coherent ethical and policy framework to approach these issues?
Brilliant student. Good question. You can see I'm sitting right on the edge of this conversation, almost shouldn't be in the room. So in a way, that's answering your question in a bit, right? The whole focus is on labor mobility. What about all this other stuff that is real and it's impacting people in the Pacific that are also very deep questions for governments in the Pacific in terms of accountability. But I when I taught governance and institutions through the Dev Policy program at University of Papua New Guinea, and I say, try to define this word policy to students and break it down into what does actually policy mean, because it's a very fancy, powerful thing that people who do policy seem to know the answers for everything. And you're asking me something that is too complex also. Why? Because I always go policy. It's about power. Who holds the power and who makes the decisions about these issues? It's about politics. I think what I've tried, what I intentionally brought the Manus Island Detention Center into the conversation when was asked to present, because politics and power are fast moving. And I've highlighted the Australian side, and everything we've heard about today is like a tap. Australian politics turns on the tap, dials it down a bit. A bit of hot water, too much hot water, dial it back. It's like that, and it's cyclical. Where is that power? The narrative here today, it's here in Australia. It's that social license, it's the political license, and it's the social contract between Australian citizens and the people they elect into government. That tap is running there. Of course, the Pacific is countering with the conversation, but the tap in terms of controlling that flow from asylum seekers to whether or not labor. We define people. Again, the other P in policy is people, not labor, not detainees, not migrants, but people. That's the P. And I constantly reminding myself, when we turn people into being labor, that's the tap. How much labor is needed in rural Australia, there, that's the tap. Whereas when we focus on people, some of these other questions that are deep-seated come in. And again, that quote by Howard, we will decide who comes into this country and the circumstances in which they come. That is foundational, and it's cyclical. Just this week, migration is back in the heart of Australian politics. I believe we might have a national elections looming, and so the tap dials up because the agreement between the Australian voter and the people, the politicians. And so just a couple of days ago, I think it was the leader of one of the major political parties almost kind of quoted those words from 2001 by Howard. It was, Australia should decide who deserves protection and the circumstances in which that protection is granted. Now, these are big umbrella terms. Protection for who? Protection for the asylum seeker seeking asylum, protection for the Pacific Islander labor person. We talked about protection in your speech. So your question is about power, it's about politics, and too often it excludes the question of people and accountability. So I can't answer it. I'm too far on this side. I'm screaming on this side to say, listen to this side of the story, but the power is so much, it's subsumed into it. That's on the migration side, the Australian, New Zealand, the gap, filling the gap in these countries. The other side is the issue I talked about, the internal migration issues within the country, holding in this case, Papua New Guinea, but Pacific Islanders, holding governments accountable for how citizens are treated in the country. That's not an easy thing to do. We're up against powerful people in country. And when you talk about evictions, I went and, for this talk, I went and did a bit of search on migration, Papua New Guinea migration policy. When I went to Australia, plenty policy on PEV, PALMs, you name it, asylum seeker. When I went to Papua New Guinea, it went to the international side, the migration, and it has a refugee policy. And I could be wrong, there are Papua New Guineans in the room. does Papua New Guinea have a policy on the resettlement of people who are evicted in urban areas? When a community of 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people are going to be bulldozed. I've asked this question, I haven't found an answer. Do we have a policy on it? I would say no. So when we don't have policies in our own countries to deal with this kind of thing on internal migration, you're asking me to give you an answer? Sorry, I can't give you an answer, except I can continue to be that pain in the neck that says, this isn't old news. This isn't, oh, it finished in 2019 and let's forget it now. Let's move on to the next sexy migration topic and policy, which is PEV or whatever. This is the heart and soul of the news. And if you didn't get that right, you're still going to run into problems going forward. So thank you for letting me say that.
With respect, you did give us an answer, and a very good one, so thank you. Did you want to offer any final concluding remarks, Elise? On anything? Good. Oh, Tash wants to conclude for us. That's allowed.
No, I'm not going to conclude. So I have also 3 connections here to the front. Those are my strands. I'm still weaving. And I'm also from Manus, like Naya. So I have a very strong relationality as well with her. But I guess the question then to you, Naya, is, in an ideal world, if we didn't have all of these barriers, then what would migration with dignity look like for PNG and how we deal with internal migration, and also more specifically how we deal with migration to Australia? I know that's quite a strong, deep question, but it's good to ask you.
It's a beautiful question because I think it comes, again, whether I give you an answer or not, Tasha, we can have coffee outside and continue, because they're big questions and they kinds of beautifully rounds back to the opening statement we had from Her Excellency, this idea of migration, what does this mean? So whereas I've highlighted here in Australia that kind of, the depth of that narrative of migration, Papua New Guinea, we've had migration going back. We've always had movement, and that's the other thing we forget. The story of the Pacific is about human mobility, you know, the whole coming into the Pacific. We're very proud of the canoes voyaging and people moving. That intensified in racialized and gendered ways with intense colonization, and it kind of changed form. And in a more, that P, the power and politics, a controlled way. Who can come into the urban center? Who can move? Was introduced into, say, Papua New Guinea, across the Pacific, the laborers coming to Queensland, laborers going onto plantations in Papua New Guinea, was controlled through the colonial period. And I suppose you could say that erodes dignity when you racialize it and you put markers on it. Racialize, men tend to migrate. You can only migrate if you're a certain type of person. You're productive and so on. I would just wanted to add the narrative in Papua New Guinea in terms of, is again that deep conversation between the migrant who leaves home and settles. Now you blow where are you from? What's your connection to this land? And the rooted person at home who still has that customary link to land. So I don't have any easy questions. In the urban setting today, we need jobs. So we need people to work, and we need jobs. There's no work, as you know. There's no houses. People can't afford houses. And whether or not the answer is in a fancy Western-looking house that's cost a lot of money, or allowing people to express creatively their way of being a Papua New Guinean, to live amongst their people in a settlement. That is also allowed for in Papua New Guinea's constitution. It's recognized, Papua New Guinean ways. To me, dignity is just recognizing that people don't get treated a certain way. It was never a Papua New Guinea custom or any Pacific custom to get a bulldozer and bulldoze a community. I don't believe that existed anywhere. So a very simple answer, dignity is not that. Dignity's got to be something better than that, yeah.
This is for
We're well over time, but I'll make one exception.
Okay, thank you. Alisi, thank you for your presentation. I know you mentioned that PNG and Fiji are not part of PESA Plus, and PNG is by far and large the largest population in the region. And I know the pilot was taken with Niue and Solomon Islands. Now, if Papua New Guinea was willing and able to fill some of these gaps in the region, would they need to sign up to PESA Plus?
That's a question that perhaps I'm not best to answer. It is a treaty. PESA Plus is a treaty. So countries who participate and benefit from interventions and programs under PESA Plus do need to be parties of the agreement. PNG was part of the negotiation. So they're not entirely outside of our circle in PESA Plus. But I think in terms of intra-Pacific, it's beyond PESA Plus. Like Dr. Naomi mentioned, it happens outside of PESA Plus. I think what we were trying is, in response to requests from countries who are parties of PESA Plus, to have a more managed approach to intra-Pacific labor mobility. But we would love to have PNG as a party.
Well, I think that is a perfect note to end on. Did you want to come down and close? Pardon? Oh, presentations will all be available online as well. Thank you, Amita. In case anyone needs to refer back.
Okay. Well, thank you, Associate Professor Edwards, and to all our distinguished panelists, Dr. Nayahamui Rooney and Dr. Alisi Holani, for such a rich and thought-provoking session. As we explore the Manus Islands experience, illustrates that migration in the Pacific is not always voluntary or development-driven. It can also be imposed, uneven, and socially disruptive, requiring policies that are not only economically sound, but also socially just, locally grounded, and regionally coherent. I find it very interesting that while labor mobility scheme generates significant development gains, they also carry real cost, community disruption, family separation, and concerns around brain drain and social displacement. And I think the key policy challenge, therefore, is not simply to expand mobility, but to balance economic benefits with social sustainability, ensuring that migration strengthens rather than fragments the Pacific communities. Well, in essence, the future of Pacific migration policy must align mobility with development, while safeguarding the social fabric of Pacific communities, and become a bridge for integration, strengthening our people, our economies, and our shared Pacific culture. So let us carry forward this Dalanor and continue to listen, learn, and shape solutions that reflect the voices of the Pacific. Malo Abito, and thank you all for your participation.